Welcome to the Humanist Freedoms podcast by Humanist Heritage Canada. We share stories and perspectives from Canada's ongoing humanist heritage. You can find us online at www.humanistfreedoms.com or www.humanistheritagecanada.ca, where you may find the Humanist Freedoms news blog. We share news, information, and stories about what we call contemporary applied humanism. It's humanism in action. Humanist Heritage Canada is our new initiative to document and share the stories of Canada's rich humanist heritage. Henry Beissel is a Canadian poet who has published 24 volumes of poetry, 6 books of plays, and countless other articles and essays during a writing and publishing career that has spanned almost 60 years. He has also been an active humanist who has played important roles in some of Canada's leading humanist organizations. Today, we're continuing our exploration of Henry Beissel's Catastrophic Glory, a collection of essays which Henry states were previously delivered as talks and speeches during various public occasions. In view of the rapidly deteriorating situation across the world with accelerated climate change and its potentially catastrophic consequences, the rapid global financial collapse, a growing threat of nuclear conflict, a human population explosion that exceeds our planet's carrying capacity, and numerous other global threats to human survival, Henry feels compelled to share his observations with hope that humanists and others who care about human survival will join forces to oppose and find solutions to the existential threats that seem to be growing in urgency every year. Henry Beissel's Catastrophic Glory. 3. Contrariness, complexity, and incongruity. Our brief introductory survey of the glorious and the catastrophic aspects of Western civilization issued in a vote of confidence in the capacity of humanity to address and deal with the problems which are, or appear to be, of its own making. Justification for this confidence is supplied by the very fact that I am writing and you are reading these lines. If the creative forces in our species were not stronger than the destructive ones, it is the result of a combination of extremely unlikely random events over a long period of time and the operations of specific physical laws in a universe that seems indifferent, if not downright hostile, to life, allowing it an infinitesimally narrow margin in which to flourish briefly and vanish again. Life is a glorious bubble rushing to burst in the very process of expanding its glitter in all the colors of the rainbow. At least, that's what all the available evidence argues, and we must act on the evidence. The fragility and transitoriness of life, instead of making us despondent, should serve as a challenge to appreciate how precious all life is, including that of every one of our fellow travelers. The frailty we share, the poet in me says, is the root of all love. This is not a morbid viewpoint, but on the contrary, it invites us to enjoy life, embrace all of life, including its inevitable passage and rebirth, as something rare and special. Our very vulnerability demands that we commit to the creative forces in ourselves and in the world around us. To cope with the critical problems of contemporary civilization, we must, therefore, engage its creative capabilities. To do so effectively, it is necessary to understand both them and their negative counterparts, what roots they spring from, and how they can be harnessed or directed. To some, such an inquiry may appear foolhardy, since it has been pursued by many a great mind throughout human history, and yet the problems of the world, so the skeptic would claim, have remained essentially the same. But this objection has several flaws. While it is true that the problems of, say, surviving and propagating are still a matter of eating and mating, the manner in which we come by food and sex has changed significantly. In other words, the problematic has remained, but the problems have changed. Moreover, as a result of its evolution, humankind has come to face many new problems beyond its biological needs. In the political sphere, for instance, we have come to desire freedom as individuals and justice in the community. In the private realm, we want to give our lives meaning and fulfill certain artistic, intellectual, and emotional aspirations. To achieve these goals has posed a multitude of new and serious problems, and these have changed dramatically over the centuries and will continue to change, partly due to necessary adaptations, reflected and unreflected, to constantly changing circumstances, and partly in consequence of the inquiries undertaken by thinking minds, which is another way of saying that human thought and action do change the world. The resignation, which takes the form of "it doesn't matter what I think, do, say, write, I can't change anything," usually stems from the disillusionment of someone who, early in life, wanted to make the world a place of perpetual sunshine and happiness for all, and then watched these aspirations come to naught. Our adolescent years are, and should be, filled with utopian dreams of every kind. But maturing means to recognize that the world will never be paradise. There are no grounds which justify optimism or, by the same token, pessimism. At least, not in the true meaning of these words. This is an ancient wisdom for the Chinese, who embodied it in the Buddhist principles of the yang and the yin. By comparison, Christianism offers a more immature view, with its romantic cosmology involving an intelligent force of goodness, God, which will at the end of time banish or destroy evil, or the devil, forever. Such a world of eternal and perfect bliss is a chimera, for it would require a halt to all movement, all change, which would result in an immediate implosion of all atoms. Time would stand still and space collapse, leaving not even a black hole. It is essential for our mental and psychic health to come to terms with the inescapable contrariness inherent in reality and existence. Life comes to us in packages of things we want and things we don't want. If you cannot cope with the things you don't want and wish to change them, you have a problem. Solving the problem doesn't mean to dispose of it, it means transforming it into one you can cope with. You end up with a different package of things you want and things you don't want. If your problem is hunger, for instance, you can solve it by eating. But now you have the problem of obtaining food. You could grow some, but not all, especially when it comes to chickens, pigs, and cows. Our ancestors realized about 10,000 years ago, as the age of agriculture began to unfold, that they needed some token of exchange other than your own produce. Going to market with a few £100 of, say, tomatoes you had grown and exchange them one by one for your neighbor's lettuce or eggs was, at the very least, time consuming and impractical. The situation became even more impossible when farming called for tools, buildings, furniture, etc. Without tokens of exchange, trade with such objects would have been impossible. Over the centuries, in a very complex process which we can no longer recover in every detail, and that is still going on today, the early farmers and the traders that attended to their needs developed tokens of exchange we now call money. Money solved the problem of obtaining food that you couldn't grow and objects you needed but couldn't make, because money enabled you to simply purchase them. But that solution created a whole bag of new problems, because now you had to find the means with which to buy things. Money. There are different ways of solving that problem: gainful employment, theft, usury, fraud, charity, welfare, but each of them lands you with another different problem, whose solution will in turn pose yet another problem, and so forth ad infinitum. Still, the effort is not wasted, because in the process you have transformed an intolerable problem, starvation, into one that you can manage to live with, paid work, for instance. On a global scale, the process created nation states, civilizations, and technology, along with wealth and war, to name but a few of the consequences of solving the food supply problem. Our transformational ability holds out the promise that we shall similarly transform the global problems which now threaten to overwhelm us into ones we can deal with. But it will not be without accepting new ways of life which we won't like. You win some, you lose some. That is a law of nature. What we can never do is solve all problems. It is crucial to understand clearly that life is a web of perpetually mutating problems which only death can solve with finality. We are today living with the disastrous consequences of our failures to accept this basic condition of the world. I remember the euphoria that accompanied the arrival of antibiotics. There was talk of the end of all diseases. Antibiotics were expected to dispose forever of the problems of harmful bacteria and viruses. Soon, we would all live in perpetual good health. Today, half a century later, we are forced to realize that we have exchanged one disagreeable problem for another, much more severe one, a combination of weakened immune systems and the resurgence of bacteria and viruses now resistant to antibiotics. The result is more sickness and more of it incurable. Another instructive example is supplied by our insatiable quest for energy. The unbridled growth of technology requires immense and ever increasing quantities of it. One way to solve this problem was to drill into the earth and extract the oil that was produced in the world's oceans by the death of algae and zooplankton in large amounts over hundreds of millions of years, seemingly waiting for us to make use of it. We have been doing just that for over a century. It is only now that we have begun to realize that, while making our lives considerably more comfortable, more adventurous, more enjoyable, the exorbitant burning of fossil fuels necessary to achieve this has poisoned the biosphere and has seriously damaged the mantle which regulates the exchange of heat and light on our planet and protects us from excessive harmful radiation. We may never be able to assess the full impact of the development on us and the other creatures in the world. But the rapidly proliferating respiratory diseases and cancers, the disturbing signs of increased deformations through mutations in some animals, as well as the unmistakable signs of a global climate change towards more severe weather conditions, floods, droughts, wildfires, cold snaps, heat waves, storms, are some of the growing number of indications that we have transformed a minor problem of, say, getting faster from one place to another into a major environmental catastrophe. Rachel Carson, in her 1962 study Silent Spring, demonstrated beyond a doubt the horrific effects of the use of pesticides to protect our crops. The same disastrous effects derive from the enhancement of our meat production with the help of hormones and steroids. They are two of the most catastrophic examples from a long list of such unintended and unexpected disasters due to well-intentioned measures which over time proved counterproductive. All of them demonstrate our failure to recognize the transformational nature of problem solving. It is absolutely crucial when we attempt to solve a problem that we learn to anticipate the new problems the solution will cause. They need to be scrupulously examined for their future implications before a rational choice can be made as to which course of action is more beneficial. Otherwise, the consequences can be dire. The legendary king Midas faced death by starvation when the gods granted him his wish to turn everything he touched to gold. We have failed to learn our lesson from this allegory about greed and about the dangers of utopian problem solving. Though all too often we disregard even this minimum survival requisite, my argument is more fundamental. Take, for instance, the pharmaceutical industry. Their laboratories spend much time and effort to test each new medication and make sure that it is safe before marketing it, because they know only too well the painful and costly consequences which might otherwise follow. But their research, even when it is honest, competent, and conscientious, is conducted on the basis of the fallacious assumption that the final product will solve the user's medical problem without creating a new one. Not so long ago, for instance, pharmaceutical companies began to produce estrogen to eliminate the suffering of women during menopause. Understandably, it was an instant success because it seemed to solve a common, often horrendously disruptive problem. Hormone replacement therapy became almost a fashion amongst women, often urged upon them by their doctors as a preventative measure. It soon, but not soon enough, became clear, however, that estrogen treatment increased the incidence of breast cancer and heart disease with advancing age, and recently Alzheimer's was added to these problems, replacing the menopausal ones. Is this a case of pharmaceutical companies acting irresponsibly in bringing a product to market too precipitately? Probably not. At least we can assume that they conducted their tests in a thorough and responsible manner, and that the findings persuaded them the side effects were less serious than the condition the medicine was intended to cure. Were the tests not extended for a long enough period of time? Probably not. It should be remembered that alongside their scientific concerns, medical researchers are driven by the profit-making objectives of the pharmaceutical company which employs them, and by the clamoring for instant gratification on the part of the public. To sick people, 2, 3, 5 years may seem a long time to wait for a new product that promises to cure their illness, but in the perspective of the eons the evolutionary process would take to effect, analogous permanent biological change in us, it is instant gratification. Given that we are by nature inquisitive and adventurous, we will always be impatient in solving problems. This, along with financial greed and personal ambition, will serve to maintain the pressures that lead to the precipitate public releases of new medications. But the crux of my argument is that whatever measures we take to safeguard against such miscarriages, we will always replace the old problem with a new one. If it's not immediately visible, it'll simply show up later. Medicine, like everything else, offers only package deals in which the harmful comes with the beneficial. If you don't recognize it, you are liable to be in for an unpleasant surprise. It's not for nothing that medications come with warnings about serious side effects. The contrariness of the world is a constituent part of its complexity, the nature of which we have only recently begun to investigate. It appears we are living in a universe in which all things are interconnected by far-reaching pathways too complex to demonstrate, except perhaps mathematically. The wings of a butterfly in one part of the world, scientists tell us, can touch off a tornado in another. Poets have always known this and have invited us to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Blake. But it took an entirely new scientific approach, such as that opened up by chaos theory, to make this extraordinary pattern of reality accessible to our rational faculties, at least in principle. The holistic view of the world, which has now emerged in a new scientific light, is both frightening and reassuring. Our little lives are intricately woven into the fabric of a virtually infinite number of interactions from the subatomic to the galactic level. We are the kin of rocks and clouds and stars, as well as of all that lives. The complexity is so staggering that we cannot and may never be able to comprehend the intricacies of this cosmic web despite all the sophisticated technology at our disposal. It's therefore no wonder, for instance, that we cannot even predict the weather accurately and reliably for a particular place a day in advance, the force each living organism contributes to the mix. Wisely, our forecasters have taken refuge in predicting weather probabilities. To complicate matters even further, the web is in reality a process or an infinite number of processes composed of the actions and interactions of parts and particles which are continuously changing, continuously dying in one form and being reborn in another, continuously reforming, reorganizing, restructuring in the very act of disintegrating, dissolving, decomposing. Whatever we observe is in the process of changing. So are we as observers. The act of observing itself changes us and the object under observation. It would be unnatural not to be frightened to find oneself embedded in such an elusive flux of things, unable to be sure precisely what the nature of reality is, let alone to know what will happen to us from 1 hour to the next, or what the long-term consequences of our actions are going to be. The existential terror inherent in the world cannot be removed by the cosmic surgery of religious cant or pious fairy tales. It is the price of consciousness, but from this it derives also a majesty that creates its own reassuring intimacy. To know yourself part and parcel of all things in the universe restores the sense of wholeness, of being, which engenders peace and strength. The starry sky is a spectacle of terrible beauty. As you gaze at the twinkling little stars and realize there are billions and billions of them, and that each of them is a ferocious nuclear holocaust which would vaporize you in an instant if you came anywhere within a million miles of it, you cannot help a shiver passing down your spine with the cold terror of it, as you reflect that the stars look like candles in the sky, only because of their unimaginable distance from you, the light which enters your eyes has traveled thousands, millions, even billions of years to reach you, and that the only thing you can say with certainty is that the stars you are seeing aren't actually there any longer, that all of them are somewhere else, that many of them no longer exist, as many have come into existence which you cannot yet see, and surely your fear and confusion can only increase. Yet, if you surrender to the experience, a sense of the grandeur and glory of the spectacle will steal upon you, along with a sense of wonder that puny you should be there to see it, and what is even more remarkable, that puny you should know that it is there to be seen and explored by you, that you should be able to name it, contemplate it, even understand and explore part of it. Suddenly, a great joy will flood you as you realize that you are part of this grand cosmic theater, that this incredible universe is your home, and that in the ceaseless interaction of all things you play a part simply by being here. Nothing is more salubrious to the human spirit than the acceptance of our puniness, along with the realization that we nevertheless participate in the cosmic dance we call the universe. Four, the challenges of being human. What does all this have to do with our civilization in crisis? Everything. Because it is the scientific revolution of the last 150 years which has deprived us of all the certainties about ourselves and the world on which our civilization was built. When Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher of the second half of the 18th century, looked at the starry sky, he saw in it, and in the moral law inside himself, proof of the existence of God. Though he had long abandoned the earlier, more naive picture of angels turning star-studded wheels for our entertainment, and perhaps for the satisfaction of a God seated on a celestial throne, watching the spectacle from the edge of eternity. When we contemplate the stars today, we see the planets circling our sun, the sun rotating on the gigantic spiral of the Milky Way, and beyond it we see clusters of galaxies, billions of them, each with billions of suns, all moving at unimaginable speeds through a vast, virtually empty space, and in our mind's eye we see the beginning of it all, around 14 billion years ago in the Big Bang, an explosion so immense that the sound of it can still be heard across the entire universe. In line with the constant changes of everything that exists, the recent December 2021 major advance in space telescopes that enables us to see further into the universe than the marvelous Hubble telescope, see beyond the time limit established by the Big Bang. Now the new James Webb telescope is locating stars that were born before the Big Bang, which means that the Big Bang is not the beginning of our universe and possibly never took place at all. If this is confirmed by reliable evidence, we can start all over again trying to understand our universe. 100 years after Kant, Nietzsche pronounced God dead. He was not, of course, writing a death certificate for the personalized Superman deity who was said to have created the world, formed Adam out of a clump of clay and Eve from one of his ribs, drove them out of paradise and sentenced them to a life of suffering and death for disobeying his orders not to eat from the tree of knowledge. then relented, fathered a son, and arranged for him to be crucified to make amends for the offense of Adam and Eve, and finally promised those who believed all this the restoration of paradise in heaven after death, and condemned to eternal suffering in hell those who refused to believe. It did not require a genius like Nietzsche to bury that particular version of God, since he had never been alive in the first place. What Nietzsche saw so lucidly and stated so succinctly for the first time was the death of the idea of a Christian God. In so doing, he also acknowledged that the idea had once been believed in and acted upon. In other words, there was a time when Christianism constituted a coherent and constructive philosophy which contributed to the development of civic law and order, and offered the individual human being meaning and solace in a world which, for most people, was wretched, brutish, and futile. By the 19th century, this ideology had become so corroded and its institutions so corrupted that its influence had long turned counterproductive. Religious ideologies arose in response to very definite needs in very concrete circumstances along the path of the development of our species. This is not the place to trace the origins of Christianity to its roots in Sumerian, Assyrian, and Babylonian mythology. Ultimately, all religions are the product of primitive minds trying to understand our complex world as they become conscious of it. Evolution has provided our species with the neocortex, a magnificent tool for asking and answering questions, particularly concerning the how and why of things. It is natural, for instance, for a cerebral animal like us, at a time when we had no knowledge of the electric nature of lightning and its creation of a vacuum, to think that thunder is caused by the voice of a being like us, only larger and louder and evidently living in the sky. Explanations of natural phenomena at this naive anthropomorphic level inevitably led to religious beliefs. The action of the forces of nature were a matter of life and death for people who were constantly threatened by the vicissitudes of weather, sickness, predators, and rival clans. Sacrifices had to be made and rules of conduct observed to enlist the support of the various deities in the sky, the forests, fields, rivers, and the sea, and to protect the individuals in the tribe and to safeguard their survival. Mythologies were born which over time developed into different systems of religious thought. Anthropologists estimate that at least 18,000 different gods, goddesses, and various animals or objects have been worshipped by humans since our species first appeared. As our species learned to understand the nature of their environment in more rational scientific terms, religious thought and action began to show retreat to social and psychological territories. Its primary occupations moved to the fields of morality, metaphysics, and politics. Such was the situation when, from the ruins of the Roman Empire, a new civilization rose among the primitive Nordic folk, Teutonic and Celtic tribes, whom the Romans called barbarians, from barbarous or ignorant, rude, and foreign. The demise of the belief systems of antiquity coincided with the opening up of the peasant world of Central Europe, which, ironically, a case of another package deal, was the result of Roman conquests. The consequences included the growth and spread of the barbarian population of Europe, its infiltration of Rome itself, the slow urbanization of life north of the Alps, with its expanding forms of trade and commerce, the need to regulate labor and protect possessions, as well as the shift of the centers of power northward. These dramatic changes cried out for and promoted a new moral and cosmological infrastructure to support the new emerging civitas. Without it, brute power would have reigned unscrupulously and capriciously. Christianism, specifically the teachings of Catholicism, provided the theoretical infrastructure which became the foundation of Western civilization. It acted on a natural predisposition of human beings to engage in and regulate social intercourse, an ethical propensity encoded by the process of natural selection in all animals for the survival advantages it bestows. Even a simple mind can understand that the survival of the fittest assures the dominance of the physically strongest in any community of animals. Now, we call these individual creatures alpha males. Their superior strength and intelligence safeguard the future of their species. Our human civilization has incorporated insights coming from the experience of earlier civilizations as handed down by tradition and written texts. The principal credit for the birth of our civilization belongs to the efforts of Christianity, whose teachings edified, pacified, and unified post Roman Europe when it threatened to descend into chaos and darkness. Two features constitute the core of Christianism, which enabled it to serve as a basis for civilization. Primary was its concrete and absolute moral code, along with the ability and determination to strictly enforce it, with carrot, admission to heaven, and stick, damnation to hell. No less important was its coherent and plausible interpretation of the human condition in terms of the fall and salvation of man. Together, they gave meaning and direction to the life of the individual as well as of the community, and left no doubts about the central place of humanity in the universal scheme of things, offering protection against the fear of death through the certainties of an afterlife. The death of God has put an end to all metaphysical certainties, and therein lies the principal cause of the crisis in our civilization. If Copernicus removed the earth from the center of the universe, Darwin removed humanity from the pinnacle of life. Between them, they have made some of the fundamental claims about the centrality of the presence of human beings on earth untenable. In fact, they show the biblical creation stories to be what they are, childish and false. Similarly, the discoveries in astronomy and physics about the nature of matter and energy, from the macrocosmic to the microscopic, relativity and quantum mechanics, have deprived theological fabulations of substance and relevance. The age of Christianism is over. Those who will protest this claim and point to the hundreds of millions of Christians around the world, I wish to remind that this inquiry deals solely with Western civilization. I refuse to speculate what Christianism may mean to the converted natives of Africa and the converted Indians of the Americas, and whether or not it can be a civilizing force at their stage of development, though I confess to considerable puzzlement over the success, if that is what it is, of a religion whose adherents and representatives came to exploit, enslave, abuse, and murder the very people it now proposes to save. Is conversion such a powerful form of brainwashing that it can make black look white? Or is it that success convinces the defeated of the power and truth of the conqueror's beliefs? Be that as it may, as far as Western civilization is concerned, its Christian underpinnings have collapsed. If it were otherwise, today's maniacal and brutal pursuit of wealth globally could not exist, since the Bible, which equals God, unambiguously declares that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. That's Matthew 19:24. That should make every true Christian a pauper. If Christian institutions still appear to be powerful, it is for two reasons. Firstly, because of their economic clout, and secondly, because fear rules people's lives. The Catholic Church, which is by far the largest Christian sect, is the biggest multinational business corporation in the world, with mind-boggling holdings in real estate, commerce, and industry. How such gigantic wealth can be reconciled with the Church's teachings of the central importance of poverty and humility as the true path to God need not concern us here. But it is easy to see what formidable political and social power such an organization wields. But force cannot create faith, and the churches are emptying out as the number of atheists and agnostics is rapidly increasing. It is also self-evident that our civilization is not shaped by a passion for anything resembling the supreme virtues of poverty and humility. Perhaps it never was. But not since the declining days of the Roman Empire has our civilization been in the grip of such blatant, unapologetic, egotistical materialism. We are obsessed with pride and possessions. Aside from a few exceptional individuals, most of those who profess to be Christians pay lip service only. Their lives couldn't be further removed from what they claim to believe. For them, the church is little more than a social club, and what they are pious about are the platitudes served them by their ministers. Perhaps the most telling evidence of Christians' lack of faith in their religion is the fact that they know so little about it. I have yet to meet anyone, apart from some who have a professional interest in it, who has actually read the Bible. Oh, yes, the book is everywhere, but how many people read it? I can't even find any of the faithful who are sure about the Ten Commandments, though they were handed down to Moses on Mount Sinai on tables of stone, written by the finger of God. That's Exodus 31:18. Christians know a handful of stories, and even those they know imprecisely, mostly by church service hearsay. If they really believed that this text was the Word of God, could one not reasonably expect them to know it by heart, or at least to be constantly reading the Bible from cover to cover? A person who says he has in his library the only book in the world which tells the truth, the whole truth, and absolute truth, and nothing but the truth, but he doesn't read it, and instead reads 1,000 other books which are trivial by comparison, such a person either does not believe himself what he professes, or he's a lunatic. Or are they afraid they might discover, as indeed they would, they themselves can't believe in the sanctity of this hodgepodge of invalid science, myth-making, erotic poetry, false history, racist exhortations, delusional grandeur, and the rabble-rousing political oratory of a paternalistic Old Testament God with the morals of Stalin? The fact of the matter is that most people lack courage. Fear is the dominant emotion in their lives. That's why they turn their backs on their minds and refuse to look at any evidence, afraid they may have to discard their hand-me-down views, break with conventions, and confront a new reality. Strike out on their own. Neither their minds nor their hearts have the courage of any convictions. It is so much easier, safer, cozier to run with the crowd and not ask too many questions. As for the supernatural hocus pocus about the Immaculate Conception and similar miracles, like turning water into wine and wine into blood, well, those things aren't meant to be taken literally, and they're kind of fun stories, but who cares anyway? We can no longer afford such cavalier and essentially cowardly attitudes, not at a time when our survival is at stake. The ethical rug has been pulled from under our feet, and unless we open our eyes to it, we will fall into a black hole from which there is no return. We no longer know what's right and what's wrong, or, which comes to the same thing, each of us is intent on determining for himself and herself what's good and what's evil. Life, the world, humanity, nothing has any meaning anymore. What remains is greed and lust, the unfettered pursuit of power and wealth, an apotheosis of egotism and nihilism, which constitutes a relapse into barbarism. It is the chaos into which Yeats saw our civilization descend when he wrote prophetically in 1920, "Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed. The ceremony of innocence is drowned." The end of the Christian era means the end of Euro-American civilization. There are enough striking and symptomatic parallels between the fall of the Roman Empire and the American Empire today to urge this reading of our situation. The Romans and the Americans share their predilection for military prowess and the overextension of their empires, which were the main causes of Rome's downfall. As nations, both were peacefully infiltrated by people of different races and cultures, which eventually overthrew the Romans and is in the process of doing the same to the Americans. Both made their cultural energies manifest in technology rather than art, in architecture, road construction, aqueducts. Both their cultures are characterized by an obsession with bread and circus, fun and spectacles. Ultimately, both their economies went into decline because their financial resources could not meet the demand of their imperialist appetites. that the Americans chose the Roman eagle for their national symbol and placed the seat of their government on Capitol Hill, where in Rome the Temple of Jupiter stood, is one of history's numerous touches of irony. The end of the Euro-American world does not mean the end of civilization. Inasmuch as a civilization can be looked upon as an organic entity, it is natural that it dies after it has flourished, and a new culture is born that embodies some of the insights of the one that died. At least such was the case with the many recent cultures. There can be little doubt that such a fundamental cultural transformation is taking place all around us today. But does it mean that we are witnessing merely another turn of the wheel of history which determines the coming and going of civilizations? That would be an event momentous enough for us to sit up and take note. That the demise of Western civilization will affect all humanity and perhaps all life on our planet. While the thesis of the rise and fall of civilizations provides a useful optic through which to view historical events, our contemporary dilemma has an air of finality that calls for a larger perspective. If it is meaningful to think of civilizations as coherent, organic entities which undergo a cycle of birth, maturation, and death, it seems valid to suggest that a species may also be examined in those terms. As applied to Homo sapiens, this would mean that our species was born in the Rift Valley of Africa a couple of million years ago and will eventually die at some time in the future. The precise dates don't matter, since they are, in any case, subject to definitions because birth and death are forms of transformation and therefore difficult to pinpoint, except by definitions. And the future depends on such an astronomical array of happenings that we cannot predict it. What does matter is the stage humankind has reached in this paradigm today. Which point in an ordinary life cycle corresponds to the current phase in the development of humanity? It is my contention that we have arrived at an extremely critical age, puberty. This is the time when you discover that you are not the center of the world, that the world can well do without you and does not care what happens to you, and that if you want to make something of your life, it is up to you to do so. The protections of home and parents fall away as the sanctuary of childhood closes its door behind you and the icy interstellar blast of a meaningless and merciless universe pounces on you. At this point, your mettle is being tested to the limit, and those whose upbringing has not prepared them to come to terms with this cruel disillusionment fall by the wayside. The current high rate of suicide for this age group testifies to the severity of the challenge and the inability of many to meet it. This is precisely the stage of development humanity has reached. Western civilization may be on its deathbed, but the human species is just coming of age. Our relentless investigations of the world in which we find ourselves have shown that we are not the center of it, let alone of the universe, and that we don't matter, that nothing in the universe cares about us, and that the future lies in our hands. Now, our mettle as a species is put to the test. Are we able to come to terms with these grim facts and commit to creating a human order on this planet in spite of them? Or are we going to despair over our irrelevance and commit suicide? The answer to this question is the silken thread by which our future hangs. If we are to survive as a species, we must build a new civilization based on the realities of the world. For us, in Western civilization, this means abandoning Christianity as well as the other Mideastern religions. We cannot hope to navigate the tempestuous seas of our time in a boat that is carrying a heavy, useless cargo, which pulls us down below the waterline. We've come a long way from the comforting fairy tales of religion, and it is time to throw them overboard. The problem with all religions is that they claim to possess the ultimate truth. Not only does this arrogance make them intolerant for those who don't share their views, it also forces them to represent their teachings as dogma, and dogma is unchallengeable and unchangeable. This is why religious teachings always become anachronistic in short order, and thereby moribund. An anachronism is the gateway to extinction because it means to be out of touch with reality. Tales of Prince Charming come to the rescue of a virtuous maiden in distress, or of the beautiful princess transforming an ugly toad into a handsome prince, may be entertaining to children, but an adult who organizes his or her life around such wish-fulfillment fiction will surely shipwreck. While the tenets of Christianism, to the extent that they constituted a direct response to existing intellectual, psychological, and social conditions, were a central constructive force in the Middle Ages, they became destructive as these conditions changed, ironically, as a result of the very changes they promoted. But in a period of social and cultural upheaval, when sickness and poverty were the order of the day, and the common law was one of pain and suffering, when the sword ruled and individual life counted for little, when the powerful could abuse and exploit the masses with impunity, an ideology which preached the dignity and equality of human beings, promoted a morality which was to combine justice with mercy, and which promised eternal heaven to the poor, not only restored hope to the desperate, but also provided the blueprint for and helped build a civilized society. This was Christianity's gift to the peoples of Europe in the so-called Dark Ages. But the seeds of its self-destruction were contained in its teachings from the very beginning, because the gift came at the price of an act of self-glorification which has proven to be more costly than anyone could have imagined. The tragic flaw in Christianism is contained in the very first chapter of the Bible, where God created man in his own image, creating them male and female, and then goes on to tell them, "Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish in the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." Genesis 1:28. Every one of these injunctions has proven a calamity. They may have triggered a civilization, but they also guaranteed its demise. For in this passage, and there are others like it, we are appointed little gods of this earth, a position for which, as time has demonstrated disastrously, we were, and still are, ill qualified. Those of us who know that these words were not spoken by any god but written by men can see in them the vainglorious conceit the Greeks called hubris, which they understood to be followed by its nemesis, the penalty exalted for overweening pride. By claiming that God created humans in his own image, the Bible actually turns humans into gods. The retribution for this megalomania and for our appalling stewardship of planet Earth, which proves that we are not gods, is now upon us. We need to understand how this came to pass, what its implications are, and how it may be addressed. Should you wish to obtain a copy of Henry Beissel's Catastrophic Glory, you can inquire at humanistfreedoms@gmail.com, and we'll be happy to pass your inquiry along. Thank you for taking time to visit the Humanist Freedoms podcast. We hope you enjoyed listening as much as we enjoyed putting the show together. If you liked this or any episode of the podcast, please consider subscribing or leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have a humanist story idea, or feedback to share, you can reach us at humanistfreedoms@gmail.com.